We now know, remember that 1 Samuel ended, Saul died. And what we learned about Saul's death, and I just want to reread that again because it becomes extremely relevant to what we're going to see in our chapter today. And it says as follows. This is chapter 31, verse 3. The battle raged around Saul, and some of the archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Saul said to his arms bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, so that the uncircumcised may not run me through and make sport of me." But his arms bearer, in his great awe, refused. Whereupon Saul grasped the sword and fell upon it. When his arms bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. Okay, so according to the story that we have in chapter 31, Saul knew he was already wounded, but he wasn't dead. He knew that he had no chance to escape or to fight against the Philistines, who were really literally on top of him already. And so he asked his arms bearer to kill him, who refused because he had this awe and fear of the king. And so therefore he killed himself. He fell on his sword. And we find here right away when his arms bearer saw that Saul was dead. So the sequence, as it is told to us at the end of chapter 31, is that he died. He fell on a sword and he died. And then when his arms bearer saw he was dead, he also fell on his sword. Okay. Now we are going to find a slightly different story in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, and we're going to evaluate it from a number of different perspectives. So let's start with that. After the death of Saul, David had already returned from defeating the Amalekites. David stayed 2 days in Ziklag. Now, you remember that we talked about how there were two stories really going on at the same time. Saul with the Philistines in the north and going to the woman from Endor, and then the battle against the Philistines where he falls in battle. And at this very same time, David coming back to Ziklag, seeing that the Amalekites had kidnapped their wives and children and taken a lot of their property. He goes after them, goes all night. The same night that Saul's with the woman from Endor, David and his troops are chasing after the Amalekites, and then all day Saul has a battle against the Philistines where he then dies, and all that same day David has the battle against the Amalekites, which he succeeds, which he wins. And so then he comes back. So right at the same time, on the third day, in other words, then he was there 2 days in Ziklag, and on the third day, after coming back to Ziklag, a man came from Saul's camp and with his clothes rent and earth on his head. So let's first talk about this. Clothes rent and earth on his head. Now, it's very interesting. The actual word, when you say clothes rent, that usually means you've torn them yourself. Okay? Whereas in Hebrew, the word is torn, and torn can either be you caught it on a thorn and it got torn, or it can be you tore it. Okay? And this becomes part of the significance of what we're going to be discussing. But when we hear about torn clothes and earth on his head, that can also very much be a sign of mourning. And we know that even today, but we know that from the Bible, when somebody is showing that he has mourning, they will rip his clothes and put ashes or dirt or something on his head or his forehead. And we've seen that already in the past, and we see it also in other places. So this is the image, okay? So, of course, it's a little ambiguous here. Is this a sign of mourning that he purposely did these things to himself to indicate that he was in mourning? Or is he running from the battle and he's muddy and he's ripped his clothes because that's how he's coming back from the battle? It really could be either way. And as he approached David, he flung himself to the ground and bowed low. Wait, let me just put this on silent. Ring. Okay. David said to him, "Where are you coming from?" He answered, "I have just escaped from the camp of Israel." "What happened?" asked David. "Tell me." And he told him how the troops had fled the battlefield, and that, moreover, many of the troops had fallen and died. Also, that Saul and his son Jonathan were dead. Now, if you'll notice, there's a certain drama in the way he's telling the story. The troops fled the battlefield. Next, many of the troops fallen and died. Next, Saul and Jonathan were dead. So we're going in ascending order from least important, the people dispersed, next important, so many of the people died, to the most important, the king and his son has died. Now, does this remind any of you of a similar kind of story? Okay, nobody's coming up with it, so I will come up with it for you. Okay, go back to 1 Samuel chapter 4. Verse 12. The story is, we are at the end of Eli's life, and there's a battle against the Philistines, same Philistines, okay? Battle against the Philistines, and Eli's children, his sons, who are not very good, they take the Ark of the Covenant with them into battle, okay? And we learn at the end of the first section of this, in verse 10 and 11, we learn about how, the Philistines defeated Israel, and that the Ark of the Covenant was taken, okay? But now let's see what happens. There's this fellow who comes to relate the incident to Eli. A Benjaminite ran from the battlefield and reached Shiloh the same day. His clothes were rent, and there was earth on his head. Same exact kind of situation, okay? When he arrived, he found Eli sitting on a seat waiting beside the road, his heart trembling for the ark of God. The man entered the city to spread the news, and the whole city broke out in a cry. And when Eli heard the sound of the outcry and asked, "What is the meaning of this uproar?" the man rushed over to tell Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were fixed in a blind stare. The man said to Eli, "I am the one who came from the battlefield. I have just fled from the battlefield." Eli asked, "What happened, my son?" The bearer of the news replied, "Israel fled before the Philistines, and the troops also suffered a great slaughter. Your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." And what we see here is, number one, we have somebody, except unlike in our story, where it is somebody, we don't know who it is initially, it's a man who came from Saul's camp or from the battle. Here we have a Benjaminite. So it has much more, okay, it's a person who is part of the team who is, he would have been there at the battlefield, okay? We have the same description, exactly, even the same words, that his clothes have been rent or torn, can be either one, and dirt on his head. And he comes to Eli, and then he says the following, verse 17. He said, Israel fled before the Philistines. So we have that, a parallel to that he says, he told him how the troops had fled the battlefield. So he starts in both cases with how the troops have fled. Next, again, there's a drama, there's a development here. There's a progression from not as bad to bad, okay? Then he says, and the troops suffered a great slaughter. And with us, it says, moreover, many of the troops had fallen and died. Next, in chapter 4, your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead. And here we have, and then he says, and the ark of God has been captured. Here we have also that Saul and his son Jonathan were dead. Now, in the case of Eli, we have two different situations. First, the sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and then the Ark of the Covenant has been captured. And if we want to analyze the meaning of these two things, we hear first that the sons of Eli, in other words, he learns first of the death of people who he is very close to, his sons, okay? Only after that, in what is seemingly going from least critical to most critical, the most critical is the fact that the Ark of God has been captured. In our situation, we have Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. And in this case, actually, In a way, you could say it's together. In the way, you could say it's reverse order. Okay. Saul is the king of Israel. Jonathan happens to be the son of Saul, but Jonathan also is someone with a close personal connection to David. So here we have, first he learns of Saul, if we're going to really specify the order in which these things are said. Saul fell, the king of Israel fell, and the last is that Jonathan is dead. Okay, so basically in the first situation, first of all, in both cases, if I look at Saul not just as a person, but Saul as the institution he represents, Saul is the king of Israel. So in the story of Eli, he learns of the disruption or destruction of one of the institutions of Israel. In Eli's case, the Ark of God, okay, which means everything represented by the tabernacle. The worship of God, not the actual worship of God, you know how we talk to God, but the formality of the worship of God, the place or the instruments of the ceremonies, okay, shall we say, of the instrument of God. You could say this is the religious institution. The religious institution has fallen in the case of Eli, and in the case of Saul, the political institution has fallen, the king. Okay, so we have the priest has fallen the first time, and the king has fallen the second time in a certain way. Okay. And but in the case of David, we hear first about Saul, the king, and then we hear about Jonathan. Okay. Now you could say they're both the same, or you could say, you know, Saul, yes, represents the king, and he's a king who we will see afterwards. David consistently, before this and after this, treats Saul, even when he's chasing him, even when he's trying to kill him, treats him with a certain reverence just because he is an anointed of God. He represents that kingdom of Israel. But I would say here, there's no question, Saul's time has ended as Saul has fallen greatly from what he was when Samuel first anointed him. And that may be the reason why there's a change in order. That's first the king. Yes, the king has fallen, but Saul doesn't represent the king the way it should have been. And what is the ultimate tragedy for David? That his dear friend from, years back, Jonathan, has died. On the other hand, you could just say they're both put together because they're both, because it's in that same sentence. Saul and his son Jonathan were dead. So you can read that in any way. But I think it's very, very interesting that we have these parallels. So I think also here we have, then as soon as we finish this, we go on. And instead of, in the case of Eli, the response of Eli is he keels over and dies. And that's the end of Eli, finished, over. Okay. And we have to remember that Eli's sons have been killed in the battle. So we learn afterwards that his daughter-in-law has a baby. So we know that there's a continuation of his line, but there's something about that finiteness. Eli keels over just as he's heard his sons have died, end of the Eli family in a certain sense, certainly end of that family in what they represented in the tabernacle and as leaders of Israel. Here, the response of David is, how do you know? David immediately is, and I'm sure he's very sad. We'll see afterwards, he's extremely sad, but he wants to start questioning this guy. How do you know? David asked the young man who brought him the news that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. Okay, so first of all, before we go to the actual, what is he asking and what is he trying to figure out, I think there's something very significant. Eli drops dead because it's the end of his leadership, and there is no continuity at that point. There's a break, and it's only afterwards that we see Samuel rises to greatness and becomes the next leader of Israel. In the case of David and Saul, David has already been anointed of God. And so really the moment that Saul dies is the moment that David really becomes king. And so what David is doing now is immediately acting like king. He's not keeling over. He's not functioning. He is functioning, and he's immediately going to start questioning this fellow. How do you know? Okay. And so he says, What happened? Asked David, tell me. Oh, no, excuse me, I skipped. We're on verse 6 now. The young man who brought him the news answered, I happened to be at Mount Gilboa, and I saw Saul leaning on a spear and the chariots and horsemen closing in on him, the Philistine chariots and horsemen, of course. He looked around and saw me, and he called to me. When I responded, at your service, he asked me, who are you? And I told him that I was an Amalekite. Okay? Whoa. So first of all, we're learning here that this fellow is an Amalekite. And what is the irony here? Okay, first of all, the chapter begins with David had just returned from defeating the Amalekites. And here there's an Amalekite. So it's kind of a little bit coincidence, but it gets more coincidence than that, as we'll see. Okay, so first of all, it's an Amalekite. Okay, what is he doing there? What's his role? What exactly is happening? And then he said, and there's another question, because if you recall the story we just read, and I reviewed it at the end of in the previous chapter, there's no mention of Amalekite, okay? And you'll see further. Then he said to me, stand over me and finish me off, for I am in agony and barely alive. So I stood over him and finished him off, for I knew that he would never rise from where he was lying. Now, this has no mention in the story we read at the end in chapter 31. In chapter 31, he has an arms bearer or his aide or whatever that he asked to finish it off, and he refuses because he's in awe of the king, and so Saul does it for himself. And here it's the same situation. Okay, we both have a Saul who's been injured in the war by the Philistines, and Saul wants someone to finish him off. But in the original story, let's remember the difference between the two stories. Chapter 31 is the Bible telling us what happened. In chapter 1, it is the Amalekite telling us his story. So if you ask me which one I believe more, I believe chapter 31 over the Amalekite, okay? But David doesn't know this, okay? David doesn't know that chapter 31's already been written with God's view, and he can look it up and see what happened in chapter 31. He doesn't have that. All he has at this point is what this Amalekite is telling him. So he's going to keep investigating. He wants to see, well, what is going on here? But we as a reader already have enough to suspect and say, well, where did this story come from? Okay. And of course, the fact that he's an Amalekite makes us wonder. Then, okay. So I stood over him and finished him off, for I knew that he would never rise from where he was lying. Then I took the crown from his head. By the way, it's also interesting. He said, the Amalekite says that Saul says, stand over me and finish me off, for I am in agony and I'm barely alive. Okay. And if you recall, when Saul originally asked the arms bearer to finish him off, he says, because I don't want the Philistines to, torture me or whatever, mock me or whatever it would be, play with his body in a way that would be a problem. Okay. Then I took the crown from his head and the armlet from his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord. Okay, so he's coming to David with Saul's crown and some kind of armband or something that must indicate also a royal decoration or something. Okay, and he brought them to my Lord. And suddenly you can ask, why is he bringing this to David? Okay, even if he was there and he saw it, why isn't he bringing it to Saul's chief of staff? Why is he bringing it to David? Okay, well, we all know that Saul and David have been rivals for quite some time, and Saul was trying to kill David because he was convinced that David was rebelling against him. Now, we don't know how much the nation knew about about the secret anointing of David, and the fact that Saul himself, before he died, admitted to David that he knew David would be the next king. We don't know how much people out there knew about that. That wasn't put forth on Twitter at that point. So we don't know what this Amalekite know, but he did know, and I'm sure everybody at the time would have known, that Saul definitely saw David as a rival. And so it's very possible that he saw David as the obvious person who's going to, don't forget, Saul and Jonathan are both dead. Now, Saul had a few sons, but there was only one son that was his partner in leading the nation. Certainly, you could say he was his chief of staff in the army. So both of them are dead. So it's very possible this guy says, this is a perfect opportunity for David, and I'm going to help him. I'm going to help him seize this opportunity. So he brings him the crown. Okay, well, let's see. That's one way of looking at it, but let's see how it is that David sees it. David took hold of his clothes and rent them, and so did all of the men with him. So the first thing that David does, and again, we have this same word, rent, torn. In this case, we know for a fact that David is tearing his clothes as a sign of mourning. His clothes don't get accidentally torn in the battle, but he's tearing his clothes as a sign of mourning. So did all the men with him. They lamented and wept, and they fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the soldiers of the Lord and the house of Israel who had fallen by the sword. And here we have the reverse order. Here, when they're talking about who they're mourning and why, the first thing they're mourning for is the fall of the king of Israel. And this is something, of course, that is, this is not the Amalekite talking. This is David it's actually the Bible talking about what they were doing, but it's telling us what they were most mourning for. So the first thing they're mourning for is the king of Israel. The king of Israel has just been killed by the Philistines. That's a national tragedy. Whether you like the king or not, it is a terrible defeat for the nation of Israel. Then his son Jonathan, well, that's the next blow, not just the king, but his heir or whatever, and for the soldiers of the Lord and the house of Israel who had fallen by the sword. All these different people start with the soldiers, then whoever else was there, civilians or whoever who fell by the sword. So it's a great time of mourning for all this tragedy. David said to the young man who had brought him the news, "Where are you from?" He replied, "I am the son of a resident alien and Amalekite." Now we know already, he had already said when the Amalekite, when he's telling his story, he is saying, Saul asked me who I was, and I said I was an Amalekite. And yet David wants to make sure, he wants that answer again. Clearly, the fact that he's an Amalekite is going to make a difference, okay? "How did you dare," David said to him, "to lift your hand and kill the Lord's anointed?" Thereupon David called one of the attendants and said to him, "Come over and strike him." He struck him down and he died. And David said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I put the Lord's anointed to death.'" So I've kind of already read this with prejudice, because very often when you read the story just straight off, you're saying, oh my goodness, you remember the story of the aide of Saul, and you said it's the same story, and the aide refused. So I guess there was somebody else there that helped him along. And you might think there's a bit of a contradiction, but it's not so important. And then you say, my goodness, Saul is dying, and it's a sort of mercy killing, whether to make his end come quicker, he's going to die anyway, it's hopeless, or in order to prevent him by being tortured and his body, corrupted or whatever by the enemy. So you're doing him a service. It's a mercy killing of sort, which is, of course, how the Amalekite is presenting it. Well, that's one way of looking at how he's presenting it. And so you ask the question, that isn't a little rash of David to kill him? I mean, he was doing a kindness to Saul. Now, we know that David took this idea of not harming the king very seriously, to the point that on a number of occasions when Saul was literally trying to kill him and David had the opportunity to kill him, he refrained from doing that, even though it would have saved his life and it would have made his life a lot easier, because he said, he is an anointed of God. I dare not harm him in any way. So some people say, well, yeah, they take this very literally, and they'll say, well, that's why he was angry at this Amalekite. But I don't think David would have killed an Amalekite because he killed Saul if it was at Saul's request. So the first question is, did this story ever happen? I'm sure the Amalekite was there somewhere, okay? But it's possible that he actually lifted the story. It could be he was there behind a tree somewhere, listening to the exchange between Saul and his aide, and saw how Saul died, falling on his sword, and that the aide refused. And he decided, this is my opportunity. Nobody will contradict my story, because the aide also fell on his sword, and he sees an opportunity to get in good with David. He says to himself, this family's done. No Saul, no Jonathan. David's probably going to be the next king. I would do well to already get myself in with good graces with David. And so he creates the story thinking, not realizing how David has been so careful not to kill the king. And so he's thinking he's going to come to David and hand him the crown and say, I did you a favor. I killed Saul for you. I should be your next aide de camp, your general, whatever, your advisor. You owe me. Isn't that wonderful? And of course, he would never have expected that David's response would be what it was. And I think when David is putting him to death, it's not, he says, because you testified, I put the Lord's anointed to death. But I think there's a tremendous comparison here, contrast actually between aide response and how the Amalekite responds, or at least how he says he responded. Okay. The aide doesn't want to do it because he has enormous awe. The Amalekite doesn't even think that way. He doesn't even hesitate. It doesn't even occur to him that maybe this is anointed of God and this is someone that we need to treat with awe and respect. It doesn't even cross his mind. And so that is already telling David something about who this Amalekite is. There's something also very, very ironic here, okay, in the story of the Amalekite. Saul lost his kingdom because he failed to kill the Amalekites, okay? David has just destroyed a bunch of Amalekites. And by the way, one of the things I was checking out today was, if you recall, when Saul was commanded by Samuel to fulfill the commandment of God already that we have in the 5 books of Moses to destroy, in Deuteronomy, to destroy Amalek, he comes back, and what Samuel says, what has he not done? He did not kill the sheep. He took them. He wanted to offer them as sacrifices or have them as booty or loot or whatever. And he didn't kill the king. And Samuel gets very angry with him, and Samuel himself kills the king. But it is on that Samuel says to him, you have now lost your kingdom. Your kingdom will be shortened. Your reign will be shortened, and your children will not, inherit the royalty. So, but then I always ask myself, Samuel didn't say he didn't kill them all. The assumption from that story is he did kill all the Amalekites, and the only one he didn't kill, put the animals aside for a moment, the only one he didn't kill was the king, and then Samuel kills the king right away. So how is it that we suddenly have all these Amalekites running around with David? He's killing all these Amalekites from the came to Ziklag and went back. We know before he was, raiding the Amalekites, and then now he has this Amalekite. So it's amazing how almost nobody asked that question. To me, that's a normal question, and I have had a really hard time finding any kind of answer. I had responded to this in the past, and I think the answer I found today is very similar to it. That basically, he just didn't kill them all, and he maybe wasn't even expected to kill them all. But then I saw that basically what happened when Saul went to battle, he went to battle against the center of the Amalekites, the main city of the Amalekites, and the fact that he was going after the king meant he was hitting the head of the serpent. In other words, the main concentration of Amalekites. But Amalekites, by definition, are nomadic tribes, so they always had some over there and some over there. But I think the assumption would have been that if he had killed the king right away and he had really done away with all of them, there would have been this amazing message that went out to all the Amalekites, like, don't rear your head again, even though a few of you may still be left. You're defeated, finished, go away. We don't want to hear from you again. And that kind of reminds me today, when there's so much discussion in Israel about how are we going to defeat Hamas? Are we going to kill every last Hamas terrorist? Well, that probably not realistic. But there's a sense that if you kill a lot of terrorists, or most of them, and you kill the leadership, including Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar, you will have destroyed Hamas, although we'll have to keep being on the alert for them, because you struck such a critical blow, and then you don't enable them to get organized again. So that's just something I thought of as I was dealing with this issue of how does the Amalekite show up. But I do think it's extremely critical that Saul lost his kingdom because he didn't kill the Amalekites. And at the end of the day, the person who is at the end of his life, now whether he killed Saul or not, it's not really important. He presents himself as if he killed Saul. And at the end, David kills him. And that is probably the most significant thing, because David is going to reverse the problems that were in Saul's reign. Saul failed to kill the Amalekite. And the first thing that David does after Saul is killed is to kill an Amalekite. Okay. And to recognize right off, and I think this whole interchange is also very important. He recognizes right off through this investigation, there's something very suspicious about this guy. And so what scripture is telling us, it's not just because his last name is Amalek. It's because he has some of these characteristics that are clearly not the kind of characteristics that you want to see mingling with Israel. So again, I did not finish this chapter. Last time I didn't even start it. This time I didn't finish it. So we will take up next week with verse 17, which of course is this beautiful, beautiful poem, lamentation that David says for the fall of Saul and Jonathan, especially Saul, a true tragic hero. So we'll take up with that next week. Any comments or questions?
That is really, really interesting how it works out, because at the beginning, the Amalekites should be killed in Deuteronomy, and then, of course, Paul just fluffs this, and then, yeah, it's brilliant.
Yeah, it really is. This closure is just, amazing. Yeah.
I like the point you made, and you said that the Amalekite maybe was looking out for himself, because remember, David had just killed a lot of them. And he knows that if he's going to end up in David's camp, he has to kind of say he's on David's side,
Well, that's great, because I had actually asked myself that question. Does the Amalekite know what David had just done to the other Amalekites?
It's possible, because it's
possible.
Area.
Yeah. And which strengthens even more than, like you're saying, if he knew, then he really realizes, I'm in trouble. I better prove that I'm, with David. That's great. Yeah.
When was Esther written? Because with Haman. So how does that fit in?
Okay, so that's a major question, because Haman is said he is from the descendant of Agag. Agag is that king that Saul didn't kill, but that Samuel killed. So the Midrash says something that I think is a little bizarre, but it's possible that one night, that one period of time that he wasn't killed, he managed to impregnate somebody. But that's a little bit far-fetched, because he was imprisoned. In other words, Saul had captured him. He may not have killed him right away, but he was in custody, so I don't see him impregnating anybody that night. But if I just go with what we just discussed, that not all the Amalekites were killed, that it's just very possible he had a descendant who was out there plundering, a few hundred kilometers away, plundering some other Ziklag kind of place. And so he missed that massacre, and then that becomes the continuation.
Yeah, that's when all the sons.
Yeah, but also there are people that I think exactly how you get it genetically or whatever is less important. I think, though, what the book of Esther is trying to say, that this is, okay, because Haman is not called an Amalekite, he's called an Agagite, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And it's also very possible that it's not that Agag, but it's somebody else, another Agag, but it's clearly an Amalekite, it's an Amalek name. And the same with, if you would say a descendant of Pharaoh, doesn't matter which Pharaoh, that it's going to be an Egyptian, okay? So someone like that, as if it's very important for the book of Esther to say, who is this enemy that Mordecai and the Jews are coming up against? It's that old classic enemy, Amalek, and the evil they represent. Yes, Claudette.
Yeah. Isn't there somewhere where the rabbis use the Amalekites as a metaphor for behavior of people?
Right. In other words, after this story and this, what we see in Samuel, both right here with David, but more importantly, the original destruction of Amalek by Saul, which of course, that whole commandment comes out of the fact that when the nation of Israel leave Egypt, the first nation that comes to attack them is Amalek.
Right.
And one of the reasons that is given, one of the, or let's say a very common, very very popular way of seeing that in Book of Exodus is the fact that here you have a nation that was just redeemed from Egypt in a most miraculous way. And you know, in the Song of Moses, where he talks about how all the nations are just struck dumb with awe at the fact that, you know, here the nation of Israel was redeemed from Egypt, from the mighty hand of Egypt, and then the parting of the Red Sea, and the Egyptians just go boom, you know, drowned in the Red Sea, and all that strikes such awe, except Amalek. So
Yeah.
Amalek is seen as a
And they struck from the
particularly
back. They struck
audacious
the weak one.
nation that they don't care about God, they have no respect for God, and they're going to go up against the nation of Israel, regardless of the fact that God has promised he's with them. Also, the Bible itself says that Amalek struck them from the weakest. In other words, he
Yes.
struck them from the flanks.
We can say Hamas
The one
did that.
standing near Moses. But
Yeah.
the weakest, the old and the sick and the
Mhm.
babies, you know, this is where he starts his, because that's what Amalek is. Amalek is just evil. Amalek looks at a people and says, if they're weak, I
Mhm.
can get them. It's
So
like
it's a type as well.
it's right. So that became, okay, initially, biblically, it's not a type, it's this actual Amalek. But then conceptually, it becomes a representation of people, utter evil, who
Mhm.
just want to kill.
Mhm.
And this, for us, it's just a prototype for anti-Semitism.
Yes, right
People
now
who
it's
look at the
happening.
Jewish people for no logical reason,
Mhm.
just want to kill them because they want to kill them for evil.
Mhm.
And they will go after the most vulnerable because those are the easiest to kill. And there's no mercy. And I
Mhm.
think that's also something you see in
Yeah.
this Amalek here. There's no hesitation about killing Saul, even though that's not a mercy issue, because if anything, you could say he was merciful, but he's manipulating a situation that is tragic, the death of this king, and he's manipulating it. So he has no awe, he has no mercy, he has no sentiment. There's nothing positive about the kind of human reactions or feelings or responsibilities that this man would have. And that would be very much in line with Amalek.
And we could say we have a modern day Amalek in Hamas, because look what they did to
100%.
what they
And
did
this
to
is-
babies and young old people, you know?
Well, when we look at not just Hamas is just the worst of it, but for years we have been talking about our Arab enemies who have done this kind of thing. And so Hamas took it to a greater level, but the intense hatred has been there all along. We have long called these people Amalek.
Yeah.
Hitler, we call Amalek.
Mhm.
There's
That's-
a question of jealousy hanging around here with the original Amalek, given that he was the grandson of Esau, would probably
Yes.
be a familial jealousy passing down through the centuries. You took the land, or you took the promises that we should have had, and we won't forget it.
Mhm.
And
I think that's
similar
very,
sort of-
very true.
and there's similar sort of jealousy today, I think, in Israel, between Israel and Gaza. There's an amazing amount of jealousy about what could have been a reasonable situation. Is we must get rid of them all, from the sea, from the river to the sea. It comes down to jealousy, I think.
Well, I think it becomes also a certain obsession.
Yeah.
A victim.
You know, like, for
obsession.
example, this is something that we have discussed, and we'll probably discuss it a little bit afterwards as well, but Saul's daughter, Michal, was married to David.
Mm.
And when Saul finds out and realizes that he will not become king and David will become king, he could have accepted it, realizing that if he keeps, you know, at the end, of course, David and Michal were separated and they didn't have children, but that's part of the continuation of the story. But if Saul had not become this enemy of David, David and Michal would have lived together in the palace, and their children would have been both heirs of the kingdom through David, but grandchildren of Saul.
Mm.
And so he would have seen his own descendants become king. And but he was so obsessed with David that he wasn't able to act reasonably. And I think you see that also when Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. The nations of the world were eager to invest and turn it into, you heard this, Singapore of the Middle East. This was what people were talking about. And there was so much money available to invest. And the Palestinians living in Gaza could have taken advantage of all of that. They could have said, okay, I'm upset. Israel still gets to be Israel, but at least we get a little something. And why don't we make the best of it and do well, right? But they're so obsessed and with hatred and with jealousy and with whatever, they can't do that. And look at where we are today because of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you so
Sondra.
much.
Thank you.
Sondra.
Thank you all. We'll see you again next week, please,
Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Be safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye.